Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys about something that I started thinking about when I looked through stuff that different people say to different people when they start talking about people's genetics. Let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing. Work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this because a lot of this comes down to people not really thinking through what they're saying in the grand scheme of things, and people sometimes having their own self-loathing or their own self-esteem damage for things that are completely outside of their control. For example, when you see people all the time, they'll tell people all the time. You see this in fitness forums. You see it in comments. Hell, I get told it all the time. People are like, "This person has terrible genetics." What does that even mean? I mean, a blanket statement like that, and when I know what they mean that for competitive aesthetic bodybuilding, a person might not have the right genes for that particular competitive endeavor, right? They might not have the genes to be a men's fitness model, okay? Not everyone does, most people don't. But people make these statements all the time, and they'll make it about themselves, they'll make it about other people, and stop and think about what that really means. When's the last time any group of people historically had the concept of a person has terrible genetics or amazing genetics as a blanket statement? The Nazis, that was the last time that was an actual real discussion, like by any group of people. And they had eugenics programs based around that. To step back and tell people, you have terrible genetics or you have great genetics, well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they probably have a different set of genetics, okay? For example, there are people who, they'll say that. They'll say this bodybuilder has amazing genetics. You got to wonder where this idea comes from. No, he's just gifted at bodybuilding, because you find that same person, some of the genes that make people great at bodybuilding actually shorten their lifespan. People might not be aware of that. I'll give you guys a perfect example. There are people out there, and I think a couple of pro bodybuilders have been found to have this gene. Bodybuilders who tend to get really ripped and stay ripped all the time. Like Flex Wheeler, I think someone had said, it turns out, because there are a percentage of the population doesn't produce the aromatase enzyme. All right? If you don't produce the aromatase enzyme, you don't get bloating, you don't get gyno, you don't get elevated blood pressure, and a lot of the problems that people get from like mega dosing testosterone don't happen there. For those people, they could use insane amounts of testosterone, and guess what? They don't bloat from it. It doesn't impact their body fat negatively. Nothing. In fact, it becomes a fat burning substance for them. Even in high amounts, they don't get any bloat. They get no gyno, nothing. And people are like, wow, that sounds amazing. That's amazing genetics. Yeah, but they die like 20 years younger, even if they don't use any drugs. Not having an aromatase enzyme or producing too little aromatase in a male leads to osteoporosis much younger. It leads to really low HDL cholesterol, so you're dramatically more predisposed to heart attacks at a much younger age, right? You have heart attacks at a younger age, much younger, all right? You have brittle bones as you get older. They have major health problems from it, yet people would say, oh, they have amazing genetics, but they've got a gene that is going to kill them young. So there's give and take. There is this whole idea that people have of this is give and take. The same thing, they'll say, well, this person has terrible genetics for bodybuilding because they have a certain bone structure. But they'll say they have terrible genetics as if they're a worthless person just because they will never be a professional bodybuilder. Well, who cares about bodybuilding? When you guys seriously step back and assess this, is everyone's goal from lifting to look like a guy on the cover of a magazine? I mean, is that really and truly what you think is going to happen from lifting weights? Is that even the reason most people get involved in fitness? Maybe some, but I would hope that most people can see through that that's not necessarily an obtainable or worthwhile endeavor. And you know what? Here's the thing. Different people have different gifts and talents as individuals, all right? So, I mean, if we were to use this crazy standard you see in the fitness world of people having good, average, terrible genetics just based upon things like bone structure and how they respond to different things, that's good or bad genetics, what about Lance Armstrong? Lance Armstrong lifted weights all the time. He had a good strength and conditioning coach. He used testosterone and growth hormone in fairly small amounts, right? He didn't even look like he lifted. Most people say that guy doesn't even look like he lifts. If we were to use this standard, people would say he has terrible genetics. How many times did he win the Tour de France? All right, how many world level endurance events did he destroy? How many records did he break? You see what I mean here? But if we were to just use this one standard that people seem to use in the fitness world now, this bodybuilding or men's physique standard, he has terrible genetics. You see the problem with that? And it's kind of like they'll look at different groups of people from around the world. And I'll give you guys another perfect example. There's something, if you were to say for bodybuilding is terrible genetics, but it makes people the best in the world at something else. How about calves? How about calves? Guys like me, like people say I have terrible genetics too because of my bone structure. And it's like, but then they'll look at my calves and go, what do you do for your calves? I have like 19-inch ripped calves right now. I don't do calf raises. I deadlift for my calves. That's it. I deadlift and ride my bike. I have massive calves. You know what? That gave my ancestors an advantage climbing up mountainsides. But you go take people in Ethiopia, what have we found? People in Ethiopia, Kenya, things like that, have like 30% less muscle fibers in their calves than any other group of people on earth. They cannot make it as bodybuilders because of that. But you know what? How many of those people win marathons and endurance events, running long distance running events? They're the best in the world. The average person from those regions who have that gene, if they take up running, end up being better runners than some of the best from any other country, just because of that one gene. And people will say, so if you were to look at it from that perspective, well, as a bodybuilder, they would have the worst possible genetics in the world. They have terrible genetics, but as a distance runner, some of those entire tribes are born distance runners. They will be able to outrun you if they practice. If they just run a little bit and get a little good at it, they will outrun in the long term some of our best marathon runners. They have terrible genetics, and that's the point. People step back and they assess this based upon one little criteria, and it's really absurd. And it's really absurd because people don't understand most genes that people have. If you've made it this far as a human being, those set of genes you have probably has some sort of advantage somewhere. At some place in the earth, that difference in genetics gave someone some type of advantage historically that allowed your ancestor to survive better in some region somewhere. Something happened to cause that, okay? So when we step back and do that, and we assess people's entire personality or entire value as a person based upon some set of genes, it's really absurd. It's absurd. And the problem becomes when people start assessing themselves and they're negative on themselves who get into fitness training. You already have this attitude here, and people need to understand that this genetics thing. You need to look at the history of bodybuilding and figure out where this came from. When I say the Nazis did that, do a little digging into the history of pro bodybuilding and come back and understand that when people are saying that with the genetics, these are people with literal Nazi ideas. That is where they got it from. There's a reason Arnold Schwarzenegger was the golden boy of the IFBB, because he was Germanic. And he had amazing genetics. Better look at who was saying that in the bodybuilding world, where they were coming from, what their ideologies were. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. There's a reason they did not want Serge Nubret to beat Arnold. They did not want a black man beating their golden Aryan boy. Okay, better again, look at the history of bodybuilding a little closer and the politics involved. This used to be discussed in detail of what happened there with Serge Nubret and Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you need to step back and ask, where exactly are these ideas coming from? You'd be surprised where these ideas are coming from that people are just repeating now all the time. You'd be really shocked at some of the politics that were involved and social ideas that were involved in the rise of competitive bodybuilding. But the problem becomes not only that, this whole judging people's entire value based upon this without assessing that maybe they have amazing genetics for something else. Maybe they have genes that make them really good at other things besides the aesthetics of their physique, but then people just say, you have great genetics, you have terrible genetics, and it's this weird blanketed statement judging them as a person. The problem becomes what happens when people get involved in lifting and they get around this community, then they start beating themselves up. You see people all the time who've worked hard, put in the work, they're making progress. They are making progress. They're moving forward. Then they get around this community and they start assessing themselves and they'll be like, I have terrible chest genetics. I have terrible bicep genetics. I've got terrible bone structure. My pelvis is too wide. Or my shoulders are too narrow. I have just terrible genetics for this. And then they start beating themselves up. They belittle their own accomplishments and their own hard work in a self-defeating attitude because they focus upon these things that they can't change. I mean, you can't change your structure. You can't change your muscle insertions. You can't change your muscle fiber distribution. These are things you can't change. They're part of who you are. But it starts being judged as a negative thing instead of just people accepting, you know what, I'm going to go train, I'm going to be fit, I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. Instead of people doing that, it starts to become this outward social stigma thrown into the fitness world by which people start assessing themselves negatively. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a big problem because it stops people's ability to honestly assess their own progress and be proud of their own hard work, because the people who weren't born with whatever set of genetic gifts the fitness world seems to think people need to look a certain way because you have to look certain ways or you don't look good, is this ideas they have which require genetics and usually drugs. It's usually the combination of the two to get that look, that people who don't have it are somehow inferior, or that they're somehow less worthwhile as a human being. And it devalues people, and it devalues their hard work, and it devalues their accomplishments. And it's something we as a community need to step back and stop doing. And we need to start telling people to screw off with that stuff, because quite frankly, it's a very negative thing inside this community. And I think that it's harmful to a large number of the people who are in here putting in the work. They're trying to improve themselves and people, but they're beating themselves up over some arbitrary set of aesthetics, and then thinking that they have bad genetics and have less value as a person somehow in the fitness world because of that. And it's really a backwards way of thinking. And I think it really is a harmful way for most people to think. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.